Hey there, I am Barb Higgins, and this is 1,000 Tiny Steps. In this podcast, I share my stories of love, loss, triumph, and tragedy as I continue to retrace my steps and ponder what led to the death of my daughter Molly. By doing so, I hope to not only help myself, but to bring purpose and possibility to those who listen. If you are ready to laugh, cry, shake your head in disbelief, then tie, buckle, face up, or slip on your shoes and join me as we begin our 1,000 Tiny Steps.
Hey everybody, Barb Higgins here, welcoming you to episode 164 of 1,000 Tiny Steps. We are in season 10, episode 3, and we are talking about lying. And so if you're just tuning in, 2 episodes ago, it was lies that we were told as kids, or that our parents told us. Last week, I talked about lies that we told, and this was all primarily a bit whimsical and tongue-in-cheek. I intimated to some of the more serious reasons people lied. I talk about my own history of lying when I would reconstruct my past. I have a pretty crappy past, and I would often reconstruct it to sound better than it was for a million different reasons. Some of them, trauma-based, and some just wanting to remember things differently. Today, we're going to talk about lies that we learned in school. When you look back 2 episodes ago, and I give all the reasons that people lie to protect themselves, to protect an agenda, to deceive, to create a narrative, to manipulate and control. There are lots and lots of reasons that lying occurs. And I talk about the fact that it happens everywhere. And that sometimes lying in the word lie isn't as black and white as it seems. Sometimes truth manipulation can be vague and gray. So something's sort of true or sort of a lie, or maybe just not described properly. So education, of course, large groups of people in one area listening to one person who is deemed the expert on whatever the subject might be, leaves a lot of room for lies or information manipulation. And so as per usual in my Facebook survey, 321 go, lies you were told as kids at school, a lot of the standard typical ones came up. You're going to need algebra to survive in the world. So that I don't know is necessarily a lie. Algebraic thought goes into lots and lots of things. I remember years ago, I was tutoring a friend of mine, Megan, and she was taking an algebra class at the tech, and she had to use an algebraic sentence in everyday life. And so we came up with one. She was having a cookout and she had to buy lettuce and the number of people coming and what would the variable be. I don't remember it now, but what I remember was being so utterly amazed that we could take an algebraic equation and apply it to budgeting for a cookout and how much food you would buy based on the people who were coming and what were your variables and what might change anyway. So maybe algebra isn't obviously usable in day-to-day life. I do think the thought process makes sense. Now, see what I did just there? I took somebody that told me this is a lie in their life, and I said, no, it's not a lie because look at this. And I put my reality into it. If I were trying to convince this person to join my religion, or convince this person to join my algebra rules club, then what I might be doing right there is manipulating information to prove that I'm right and they're not. See how easy that is? So maybe that's a silly example, but the more I study this and the more I research the lies that we all believe, the more astounded I am at what I'm finding out. So education. Public education, for the most part, is considered a way that everybody gets an equal shot at life. You don't have to pay for it, so everyone can go, which means the poorest of the poor can sit next to the richest of the rich and all receive the same education. I've been a public school advocate my entire career. My reasoning has always been every child gets a box of crayons, a desk, a hook for their coat, a place for their boots, and lunch. And this is not true at all for a variety of reasons. But the initial beginning of public schools in the Industrial Revolution, when they really blossomed and exploded, was to prepare young people for the Industrial Revolution, for working in factories, right? So you sit all day at school and you sit in rows, you listen for a bell, you do your work, you listen for the bell, you go to the next class, you sit in your seat, you do your work, you listen for the bell, you learn in a big group. It created a reality of a schedule that could then be easily transferred into the working reality. You get up every day, you go to your job and do your work, you come home. I remember when I was getting my tags, my certificate of advanced graduate study, I took a class, and there's a song called Little Boxes, and it talks about the little housing developments, and all the houses looked the same, and all the cars were the same. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, all the husbands came out and kissed their wives goodbye and waved to their children and went to work. and how we lived this dream, this sort of American dream kind of thing, which is also a pretty big lie. As society changes and lifestyles change, so too does the need and the mission for schooling and what is it developing. COVID changed the whole reality of public schools because now kids were home and they were learning online and they could do different things to show that they had learned something. And so the extended learning opportunities that children have now are vast compared to what existed even 10 years ago in public education. Lies in education, and why are they told? Okay, so I'm going to talk about something first called hidden curriculum. Hidden curriculum exists in everything, in your parents' raising of you, in your teachers' teaching of you, in your society's training of you, in your religion's training of you. A hidden curriculum are all of the subtle nuances that you learn just by watching and communicating, being taught how to behave in certain social situations. So hidden curriculum can address things like how you act, how close you stand to someone, what you're allowed to say and not say, what's appropriate to wear. Sometimes gender roles. Girls are supposed to be this way, boys are supposed to be this way. How do you respect your elders? All of those things are hidden curriculum. Oftentimes, the hidden curriculum norms that dictate public education in America are white male agenda beliefs. I want to say that this is not a criticism of this. It is more of a reality of it. But what it does is it subjugates every other reality, female white people, male and female Black people or brown people or Asian people or indigenous people, wealthy people, poor people, well-educated people, not so well-educated people. Everything else becomes different. When I was first doing my student teaching, when I was in college, I had a class, I remember being amazed by it. It was in Newton, Massachusetts, and there were like 17 kids in the class, and 6 of them were just Caucasian white folks like me. The other 11 kids were from a variety of places. There was a Turkish boy. There were 2 boys from Japan. There was a girl from Korea. There was a girl from Russia. There were 3 or 4 Hispanic children who they were from a variety of places. And then me, right? So I remember I had some boys, they were horsing around in the back and I was speaking to them and they were all standing there and all of them were looking at me except this one little Japanese boy, and he was looking down and I kept raising his chin to look at me. And the minute I let go of his chin, he put his face down again. And I was beginning to get frustrated, not like angry, but I wasn't sure why he would look at me so I could have eye contact with him. Well, come to find out, it's not a cultural norm in Japan to look your elders in the eye. That's a sign of disrespect. He was respecting me, and I was looking at it as disrespect. That's a hidden curriculum item. We see hidden curriculum more obviously when we work with children that are perhaps neurodivergent or nonverbal or on the autism spectrum, where they have to be taught when something is funny or something isn't funny. Think of the Big Bang Theory and Sheldon and how inappropriate he was in social situations sometimes because he didn't always understand the hidden agendas. I remember when I taught health at Concord High School, I would often talk about how malleable we are to change our behavior and our language and our tone of voice and what we might be wearing, depending on where we were, who we were with, and what our purpose was. And I would often say, you don't swear in church because when you go to church, you have a reverent state. If you get a new job, you don't show up the first day in your pajamas. You put on nice, clean clothes, you do your hair. You can look around and see that you have to change certain things to fit in, to do what's expected of you. None of this is intrinsically bad. It can be manipulated and used in negative ways. And I do think historically in the United States, a lot of the hidden curriculum has been around subjugating anyone who wasn't a white Western European, an immigrant from the accepted countries. And even within that realm, some countries and immigrants were put above and below others. What it says here, the definition I got online from Wikipedia under hidden curriculum is every school is both an expression of a political situation and a teacher of politics. You have social and moral lessons that come into play every day. Teachers and students contribute equally to the beliefs around these things. I know when I first began teaching, we were really, really encouraged to be very neutral in the classroom, to not wear a presidential candidate shirt or a religious shirt or anything that gave a specific view of what you believed. Because anyone in your class that didn't believe in you or with you or believe what you believed would now feel uncomfortable, and that would interfere with learning. And to this day, I feel that that's incredibly important. There is a time for individuality and self-expression, and there are sometimes moments where the good of the group needs to be first. And I think when you have a room full of children who come from a variety of backgrounds, neutrality is safest because everyone can feel comfortable there, especially young kids who don't always feel they have control over what they've been told, right? Schools at the get-go are just a frying pan ready for the sizzling of potentially positive and negative indoctrination or belief systems. Lots of hidden agendas occur around race and issues around, racial superiority, around sex preferences. So sex meaning straight, gay, bisexual, that sort of thing. Around gender, both a tomboy for a girl and an effeminate boy, along with gender identity and the trans movement, and social class, wealthy people, poor people. What neighborhood do you live in? Where do you buy your clothes? All of those things can sort of play into aspects of hidden curriculum and how truth is perceived, right? So this just sort of sets the stage for the lies that we get told. Two movies came to mind for me that really illustrate this well. One is Hidden Figures. Hidden Figures is about the Black women that worked at NASA in the 60s and got, the astronauts into space. They were amazing mathematicians, and how they had to overcome barriers of being a woman, barriers of being Black, to gain access and to get jobs there. They weren't paid well. It was an amazing movie that laid out what it was like to be a Black woman in the 1960s at NASA. Another movie, it's actually a book that was made into a television series on Apple TV called Lessons in Chemistry, and it was about a female chemist. And boy, you look at the lives of she and her partner, who ends up dying in the middle of the series, but in their daughter, and all that they go through because of the quirkiness of their personalities and their roles in society and what people thought of them and how money can drive so many things. So those are two things, if you like movies and TV shows based on real things, those would be good to watch. So I start off with hidden curriculum only because even the truest of the true can be colored by who's saying it, right? So I remember one time, so this gets into sort of implicit bias. We have to be careful how we teach things. We recently had a situation in a district where there was a printout that was, for the most part, a very well and written for middle school age students summary of three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Unfortunately, the teacher's implicit bias toward Christianity flowed through it. And so when you read it, if you were Islam or Jewish, you might be thinking, what the hell? Like, this makes us look bad. I had to read it 2 or 3 times because having been raised Christian, but now in my whole adult life being a Baha'i, I look at all religions as equal. And so I had to read it 2 or 3 times to really pick out examples of that sort of implicit bias. So without meaning to, this teacher was giving an air of superiority for Christianity in this handout. And a very astute student of hers from one of those other religions went home and said, look at this. This seems weird. And the parents brought it up. We had an amazing conversation about it because we have to, make sure the curriculum in our schools is not offensive. Well, let me take that back. But it isn't pointedly discriminatory because my truth might offend somebody and someone else's truth might offend me. So it is impossible to think we can go through life and not be offended. It's what we do with that offense that either helps us grow or divides us. The first place I looked was asking people, okay, everybody, what were some lies that you were told growing up in school? So I'm going to read them off my little Facebook page here. That algebra was useful. Algebra is actually useful. See, there I go again. All right, that Pilgrims and Native Americans got along swimmingly. This is a huge one. And it's not just Pilgrims and Native Americans. It's the whole Native American culture to begin with. I talked about this a little bit in my live this morning. That was a major one I learned, that Native Americans were called Indians and they were savages. They were awful, and we had to clear them out so that the wonderful white men, we could westward expansion and turn this into our beautiful country. That was absolutely how it was taught to me in 1970. That's how it was written in the textbook. And the pictures will show the cowboys on their horses and the Indians with their big spears, and I remember being petrified, like, oh my gosh, I would be so afraid to run into an Indian. Okay. That was me at 7, believing what was in the textbook. So tied into that, of course, is Christopher Columbus and discovering America, which was the next one on my list, that Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, he actually hit ground in the Caribbean and brought with him unbelievable, Atlantic slave trade and all sorts of horrible white people over everyone else, oppression and poor treatment. In 2024, we still argue over whether it's Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, which will be a week ago by the time you hear this. In my opinion, there's already an Indigenous Peoples Day in August, but I really think we need to sit and look at what that day should be. How about Truth in History Day? Or, Christopher Columbus was an Italian, not a great example of an Italian, but what about Italian Heritage Day? We have amazing Italian American citizens that maybe that would be a great sort of day for that culture and get it away from Columbus. But in New Hampshire, we were just told that in public bodies, it has to be called Columbus Day. We had changed it on our calendar a couple of years back. There's mistruths in education. Why are they told? Well, two things, and this was incredible to me. So we have the Cowboys and Indians narrative of indigenous people, and we have the pilgrims getting along with the Native Americans. So there's Thanksgiving, right? That whole story. Why do we have that? Well, one, to preserve the idea that America is the greatest country on earth, and that the poor pilgrims who came away from oppression to come here and find freedom were the victim, and that the people in the way of their happiness were the Native American, the indigenous people that already lived here. That's the narrative that is painted, and we have to perpetuate that by continuing to make those white settlers the victims, right? They were here trying to live a good life. That's part of it, promoting a political agenda. The other piece is textbook sellers. So back before internet, where you can sort of find everything anywhere, with a simple ask of Siri, people wanted their textbooks bought. So Texas, the state of Texas, is one of the largest producers of textbooks, educational books. And so they write books that people will not be offended by. There we go again to being offended. So you get a very, very watered down version of something that might have happened. So there's lots of examples of this, and I'll talk about those as we go through. Amazing, huge chunks of reality are left out of history because of these things. So here's another one that isn't so much a fact. If you study hard and always try to do the right thing, it will always work out later in life. No, that is not true. You can study as hard as you can and still fail the test. You can live a perfect life and still lose your child. Does that mean you should not work hard? No, but to use that as a carrot for all things working out is probably not true. Always trying to do the right thing pays off. Sometimes no. Sometimes what pays off is money. That Martin Luther was a heretic and a turncoat. So this is interesting. This one comes from a friend of mine who was a recovering Catholic. The control of the church around what people look like and who they are is a huge piece of lies told in public education. So back to the Columbus one. For all intents and purposes, Columbus was not a good man, but I have a very religious friend who jumped right on here and said Christopher Columbus was an excellent and holy man, and that it's the Freemasons that demonized him and tried to rewrite history, and why they try to paint the natives as peaceful people. Now, we're going to get into the residential schools in a minute and the relationships between indigenous people and the Catholics as we go along. So I'm going to apologize right now to my Catholic friends, but this is a piece of your history that to love your religion, you have to own all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But here we are, right? This is why lies can perpetuate, because I have two people here thoroughly espousing what they believe to be true. If you just look at the actions of Christopher Columbus, my opinion is that he is not a holy man whatsoever. But that's me. But again, religions have to push their agenda to get you to believe in them. I got this one a couple of times. You're not going to walk around with a calculator in your pocket. You better memorize your facts. So I was told that, but based on the size of the calculator I had to use when I was in elementary and middle school and high school, I wouldn't have walked around with one. Now that I have it on my phone, I can put it right in my back pocket. At the time that was said to these students, it was not a lie, but now it would be. I don't think a teacher could say that. Now you can whip out your phone and do your math facts. So then Gracie, my daughter, responds, I'm still waiting on when I'll be using the y equals mx plus b formula. So let me go back to algebra. And then someone wrote, I'm waiting for the moment that hot cross buns played on a recorder will be needed in my adult life. So some of these are funny and they make me laugh, but some of them really make you think. Here's another one, that not doing your work on time means you won't have the discipline to be a good employee. This goes right back into hidden curriculum and preparing people to work the factories, keeping the middle class. This is all about societal control, that you want the wealthy people to be here and the middle class to be here and the poor people to be here, and they all have to stay in their place and stay in their lane for society to work. That the world was cooling and there was going to be another ice age by the mid-2000s. I remember this actually. Before climate control and climate change and all this was a much more politicized conversation, it was the ice age coming back that scared everybody, not the big meltdown. Climate change is a huge political manipulative tool. When you look at the veracity of the hurricanes right now and how frequently they happen compared to years past, You could say, yeah, we're heating up our planet and negative things are happening. I do believe, however, you can look at, history of the Earth hundreds of years before, and that the Earth goes through phases of lots of storms and then not lots of storms. So again, truth manipulation. What do I want people to believe, and how can I use facts to support me? You have to have a degree to get a good job. This is probably one of the biggest lies. And I do believe getting a college degree used to only be something wealthy people could do. Poor people couldn't afford college. So the poor people became the custodians, and they became the carpenters and the laborers, and the wealthy people went off and became the doctors and the lawyers. And we kept everyone in their lane. Now that college is much more affordable for everybody and far more widespread, a much bigger variety of people could get a college education. It became synonymous with success, social success, not necessarily getting a good job success. And the truth of that pendulum is swinging back. And now, truly post-COVID as well, so many other trade jobs and jobs that you can create without a college degree are coming into play. Colleges don't like this. The almighty dollar rules the truth. Then I had somebody tell me that the only meaningful things they retained from high school are things they learned in my class. I taught help. I told the uncomfortable truth. I used the genitalia words. I'll talk about that in another episode. Here's another: the Indians were the bad guys. That if you always did the right thing in your life, things would be good. So this was from an angel mom friend. So yeah, I've been a good person, and I still have a dead kid. By the year 1983, all of America would be using the metric system. I was told this. I was told this in second grade, and it was horrifying. I just couldn't wrap my head around inches versus centimeters. And oh my gosh, all of it. Now that I'm a runner, I have a much better understanding of meters because so many of my races were in meters. This is where we get into factual truth versus religious belief truth. My religious friend here says Freemasonic theory of evolution. I remember I taught in Massachusetts my first year teaching, and I taught evolution as a theory, right? Because when you look anthropologically at the evolution, the evolvement of the human species, you can see that we're very closely related to the apes. And of course, I was yelled at by my principal because Woburn was a very Catholic town, and I had to teach creationism only, which is Adam and Eve. If you're an atheist, you don't believe in Adam and Eve and the whole story of the Bible anyway. Hence the word theories ahead of these things. So I do not believe that the Freemason belief of evolution or theory of evolution is a lie. It's a theory. Do your research to see if you think it's true. This is where lying and truth-telling becomes very gray. My friend here is a hardcore Catholic, and she just truly believes that the only way any of us are going to get into heaven is through Catholicism. And so I love her dedication, but I look at everything through that lens. Our world map. So that world map changes all the time, right? Because borders change and boundaries change and countries change. Yeah, so if you looked at the globe from when I was 7 to now, it would be completely different. That you must go to college to survive or make a livable wage. So they keep adding them here. So some of them are the really honest ones and obvious ones, and a lot of them are social. So I know as a health educator, when I got certified to teach health in the state of New Hampshire, I did it through reading and writing a paper. In one of the chapters of my paper, I talked about social expectations based on whether you're male or female. And so for a long time in health class, you learned about, your body smells, and you learned how your body functioned. Boys learned about erections and how they could happen for no reason, and you had to be careful of that. And girls learned about their periods and all of this. And then they also learned very, very clear social expectations that boys should be tough and firm, and it's their job to take care of everything, and they shouldn't be questioned. And women were trained to absolutely adore their husbands. They should always look nice. They should smell good. That it was our job in a relationship to be a certain way. And much of it was putting the husband first. And I look back at some of those societal expectations and I'm horrified. Now, was that a lie? I don't know that it was necessarily the truth, but it was an agenda. It was a hidden curriculum message that this was how you were supposed to be. So I went online and I did some research on ways that education lied to us. So let's have a look here. This is a website, The Biggest Lies, Katie Couric News, katiecouric.com. So she talks about some of the biggest lies in education, and they typically happen in history. The biggest lies were taught about U.S. history. And again, depending on the religion and where people are coming from. So there's a historian named Lowen who wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. The problem is a lot of this book centers around racial lies, and he references 2 white people as the heroes for ending racism. or uncovering racism. So I think when we get into the whole white male idea of truth, this book can have its ups and downs. Katie Couric interviews him and talks about some of the things around racism and why certain things are taught that way in public schools. In her interview with this author, what she wrote about, what she uncovered was all the reasons that lies can even exist in education. One of them was textbooks. Publishers don't want to offend people. They want history to be a sweet narrative. They want everyone to read it and believe it could be true. So if you get too ugly, people are going to look away from it and be horrified by it and not want to believe it. So who decides what's being taught and what is in textbooks? So this is where the Texas explanation came in. No publisher wants to not be able to sell a textbook in Texas because the entire state of Texas teaches uniformly across the state. So if you learn from textbook B in Dallas, Houston students also learn from the same textbook. So those textbook companies cater to Texas because it's a huge state with a big population. So the question was, kids in this country being taught the history of the United States according to Texas? Yeah, they are. So here's an example of some lies or sins of omission in education. If you look at the succession of the states that left to form the Confederacy, they all say, why? It's about slavery, period. Everyone knows that in this history field, and we're looking at history in a textbook, you're mystified. Because in the textbooks in Texas, it doesn't mention slavery. It just mentions the states wanting autonomy. There's no clear answer why they separated. It was more they wanted their own control. We all learned that it was about slavery. Why wasn't that put into Texas? Well, there was huge, huge control. The South had slavery, the North didn't. Westward expansion was occurring. The Southern states wanted the westward expansion to adopt slavery, as in Black slavery. The white states wanted the Western expansion to only have white workers, which is basically racism over indigenous people, right? So now you have a battle of control and over who can make the most money, because slave trade allowed people to have free labor or very, very poorly paid labor so they could make profits on whatever their business was. Then it asks, are history books more accurate now? Actually, no, not too much. So now we're going to go through some specific things that Katie Couric points out that we were misinformed on as educators. So we're taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. There were 100 million people living here in the Americas when he got here. So he didn't discover anything. He just stumbled upon it. And there were many that came before Columbus, the Vikings perhaps, and others from different places. And he landed in the Caribbean and started the transatlantic slave trade. So there's nothing holy about that, but many Catholics will tell you that I'm wrong. What are we taught about indigenous people in this country and what actually happened? Mostly we're taught that there weren't very many of them here and that they were kind of roaming around. So the 400 Native Americans massacred by the pilgrims or the settlers in eastern Massachusetts weren't roaming. That's where they lived. When the massacres started, they packed up and started to roam so that they could preserve life and not get murdered. There was a great movie with Kevin Costner, Dances with Wolves, and he becomes a member and a loving part of a tribe, and they have to pack up and move because the westward expansion forces them out of their areas. They're sort of forced to be nomadic. So we learned that they already were nomadic, that they were savage and untamed. Well, if your idea of tamed is obeying a pope, then you're right, they were untamed. What are we taught about our founding fathers? A lot of what we're taught apparently is accurate. There were some achievements in the Constitution and the way that the government was set up that are pretty notable and were ahead of their times. But that's true. You have a pretty amazing government. It's a constitutional republic, by the way. It's not a democracy. However, it's not just that we wanted religious freedom from England, that we didn't want to be governed by the king anymore that led to the revolution. A lot of it had to do with Native Americans. George Washington, who was considered a local hero, wanted Native American land. He wanted to take over land. Unbeknownst to me, until studying for this, Great Britain had a treaty with the Native Americans that they wouldn't take over their land. There were English people, English settlers here long before the Pilgrim settlers came here to sort of take over and make it New England and the United States of America. Part of the war, part of the Revolutionary War was us fighting with Britain so that we could get rid of the treaty that preserved Native Americans' rights to have their own land. Kind of makes me not like being who I am. I'm a daughter of the American Revolution right here. I was today years old when I found that out. So George Washington was saying, yes, we want the land. We're going to take over the Native Americans. Great Britain was saying, no, we have a treaty line with the natives. You have to honor the treaty line. And that was a huge piece of the American Revolution. Wow. Racial relations. If you ask any US citizen, what's the biggest racial issue? The first thing that comes to mind is blacks, which makes sense because of the history of slavery in our country. And what gets the most notable and most press is, the Civil War in North-South. So many Americans don't understand what the nature of racial relations was like between 1890 and 1940. So there was this massacre at Wounded Knee, which is in the Midwest, and the passage of Mississippi's new constitution was limited citizenship to whites. And then every southern state followed suit at the end of the 1800s. That was after the Civil War, when slavery was now illegal, but now we're having state constitutions that say that Black people can't be official citizens in those states. So did the Civil War really end slavery, or did it just end it in Confederate states, but it still gave Confederate states power to keep Blacks subverted and in their control? You don't learn all these things necessarily. So then we learn about discrimination in the South, the Jim Crow South, where Blacks as a group were horribly discriminated against by the whites. The problem was bigger than that because there was national discrimination, because there was discrimination with Indigenous people nationwide. There were laws state to state to state that made interracial marriage illegal. So marriage between Blacks and whites, marriage between Indigenous people and white people. So anyway, all of that plays into the racial lies that we're told. Then we're told that once you learn the truth about the past, you can reteach it and now accept the truth is the truth. No. And a really good example of this is my friend here on Facebook that just proclaimed as a Catholic that Christopher Columbus is a holy man. The Native Americans were in fact not good. Where do you go from here? It's pretty hard to say. I go back to the conversation I had with my school board members the other night around how do we teach religion when we're studying, ancient Mesopotamia and medieval times. You have to do it in a way that removes implicit bias. How do you do it if you don't know you're being biased, right? So truth in educating isn't as black and white as it seems. So that was a bit more theoretical and maybe hard to follow. So I have another list for you. This comes off of BuzzFeed. So school is where you go because you think you're going to learn the truth, right? Not necessarily. So Rosa Parks, she's famous, famous, famous. Everyone can recognize that name. She wouldn't get up out of her seat on the bus. Well, she wouldn't get up, but she wasn't sitting in a section that was reserved for whites. She was in the black section, but it was the first row of the black section, and the white section filled up. And so the bus driver insisted that she move, and she didn't want to move. She was sitting in a seat that was designated for her. And other notable Black citizens had also not stood up in buses, but hers became the story that we associate with it. A woman named Claudette Colvin was arrested prior to her for not giving up her seat to a white person. And that was required by law at that time. And this was 9 months before Rosa Parks. We only use 10% of our brain. According to studies found by the Association for Psychological Science, that's a myth. It's rooted in popular culture. This can all be debunked by modern technology. You have a PET scan, right? Where they put electrodes on your head and watch how your brain reacts to different things. Your whole entire brain is working all the time. They're using 100% of their brain. We're using 100% of our brain. Number 3, encyclopedias will always be the best starting point in research. You won't ever be able to find much online, especially not using Ask Jeeves and Google. I remember this. So when I was in college, there was no internet. Well, there was, but it was brand new and it was dial-up and it wasn't accessible to anyone except the highest people in technology. And I remember Ask Jeeves. Jeeves was a character in a book by an author called P.G. Wodehouse. He was like a butler and he was really smart. He knew everything. Ask Jeeves was like a website to get information. And then Google or now Siri or Alexa, we can just ask the question and 5 or 6 resources with answers come up to those questions. So, at the time, that was a true statement, or we thought it would be true. It certainly isn't now. The Nile is the only river that flows north. Okay, I never learned it. I learned that was one thing that made it unique, but I always learned that there were a handful of rivers worldwide that flowed north. The Boston Tea Party. So this is interesting. Because I grew up in New England, all of my U.S. history as an elementary and middle school student centered around the Revolutionary War and the beginning of our country because it happened here. Kenny, living in Harrisburg, grew up learning about the Civil War because he lived right on the Mason-Dixon line, right in the heart of the divide between North and South. So that was what he learned all the time. He knows a lot more about the Civil War than I do. I know way more about the Revolutionary War than he does, or I know what I've been taught. So the Boston Tea Party was all taxation without representation. So you look at it like, oh, the evil British are going to tax the poor Americans and raise the prices of tea. Actually, it was much more insidious behind it. There was a Dutch tea. The tax on it was lowered to make more people buy it, which would ultimately bring in more tax revenue. But there was a black market tea trade by a lot of the higher ups, the government, and they were making a lot of money on it. And if the Dutch tea, which was the tea that everyone could easily get, was more affordable, they wouldn't buy the black market tea. And so they chucked all the Dutch tea in the harbor. So really what it was doing is trying to keep, the 1700s version of big pharma in business, right? Money was behind it. But we don't learn it that way. We just learn about how evil taxes are, which they can be. But mostly it was this keep those founding fathers getting rich off the exploitation of the tea market. The food pyramid. This is huge to me. I remember margarine being healthier than butter. And when you look at the history of margarine and the fact that animals don't eat it, if you put a stick of butter and a stick of margarine on a plate outside, within minutes, the butter is covered with ants. Ants never go on the margarine. They don't touch it ever. If that's ever a reason not to eat a food, if ants don't go on it, you don't want to be eating it. Ants go on poop. So let's be clear. If they're staying off of butter, it has to be bad. The initial food pyramid was incredibly unhealthy. It had all sorts of processed foods as your major food group at the bottom, breads and cereals and rice and pasta. You're supposed to have 6 to 11 servings of those a day. Above that was fruit and vegetables, okay? So that was a little bit less. So eat more starch, mostly starch, then eat fruits and vegetables. Then at the top, eat meat and fish and dry beans and eggs and nuts. And then at the very top, fat. The fat piece is probably pretty accurate still. You don't want to have a ton of fat in your diet, but all those processed carbs and low fat foods wreaked havoc on human bodies. So in 2005, an abridged version came out called My Pyramid. And I remember when I did my sabbatical, I did a health curriculum for elementary school students. And the My Pyramid was so difficult to teach because I knew enough at that time. I had not yet started CrossFit, so I hadn't really looked into healthy eating. But I did know that what I was looking at didn't make sense, that the Food and Drug Administration was pushing highly processed foods that were full of chemicals, dyes, and all sorts of things to get us to eat it. And to this day and age, even though we all know that the food pyramid is, a kibosh and not accurate at all, America is still rife with foods using dyes and processed foods being pushed, and healthy foods not being pushed. When I watched The Secrets of the Blue Zones Live into 100, in countries that are healthy and communities that are healthy food is the least expensive. McDonald's is more expensive than a gourmet restaurant that serves healthy local food. So that's an interesting sort of thing to think about. If you want to eat healthy here, you have to have money, which keeps poor people sick, which keeps big pharma. Anyway, on we go. So the food pyramid, and these are things that control the masses. Our country, I believe, is thoroughly dictated by the Food and Drug Administration and by the pharmaceutical industry. The things we're willing to do to children and adults in the name of medicine is big, and that comes through telling lies to the populace. This is an interesting one, that everyone has a learning style. So go back to hidden curriculum, go back to what we're trying to do when we educate the masses. So if we pigeonhole people into their learning styles, we can tell children at a very young age what job they should have. Oh, you're a visual learner, so you should go work in a factory where someone can show you what to do, and then you just do that all day long. Oh, you're an auditory learner. You should go into a communication field where you're talking with people and where you're taking in information by listening to it. Oh, you're a kinesthetic learner. You learn by moving, so you should go into athletics or sport. Like, we pigeonhole people. Now, maybe I have a strength. I know for me, I need all modes of learning to take information in. I think I probably represent the truth. And the truth of the matter is, all of us can learn in a multitude of ways. But by pigeonholing someone, by telling a child, you are this, they believe that's what they are, and then they rise to that occasion. If you tell a child they can't do something, and you get them to believe they can't, they will never do it because they'll believe that you're telling the truth. So it's interesting, visual, kinesthetic, auditory. There's no such thing as a learning style, or that we have one. 90% of participants in this study with 700 people believe that they learn better if they're taught in their style. And actually, we all benefit from getting information in a variety of styles. We only have 5 senses. So this goes way back to like the time of Plato, where every sense had an organ. So your eyes see, your mouth tastes, your nose smells, your skin feels, your ears hear. But as we went along, we started to develop systems. You have a nervous system. So you have proprioception, so balance. Balance is definitely a sense, right? You can sense things by a sense of balance. You have intuition. You have your cardiac system and your heart and all these kinds of things. You have feelings and emotions. So it's interesting, depending on your definition and how specific you want to get, there's probably a long list of senses. And there would be. Intuition could be a sense. Memory and what you remember and how you remember could be a sense. It's interesting that cannabis is a gateway drug. The whole drug issue, governments funding and controlling drugs, the influx of cocaine from South America, the DARE program where police officers went into schools and warned kids, if you start smoking pot, that's going to lead you to other things. Well, I think if you start to drink, I think when you're drunk, you might be more inclined to smoke pot. I think if you're drunk, you might be more inclined to snort coke. I think that when you use anything that takes away your ability to make a good decision, you're more inclined to make a second poor decision. Sadly, big lie is that alcohol is an acceptable, healthy way to have fun. And alcohol is probably one of the deadliest drugs. This is something I taught in health class as well, that because alcohol is legal, it lies to us. The message lies that it's legal. You can buy it on the highway in New Hampshire. There are commercials, beautiful women holding their drinks. Turning 21 is this big thing to celebrate because now you can drink legally. It gives this message that alcohol is safe, and alcohol systemically wreaks havoc on the body in a way a lot of other drugs don't. But it's considered safe because it's legal. Look at those truth manipulations. The spread of disease. So STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Fear has often been a way of teaching people things. I remember when I first taught health in the district, I don't know if it's still this way, I should check, but funding for health curriculum came from the federal government only if you taught abstinence only as your major method of teaching sex education, that abstinence was the only way to prevent anything. Well, quite honestly, if nobody ever had sex with each other, there would be no STDs and there would be no babies because nobody would be having sex. So in the weirdest way, that's very true. So I, in my very honest way of teaching health education, would always say, let me reiterate, the only way not to get pregnant is not to have sex. Having said that, if you do want to have sex, here are some ways that you can help prevent that from happening. This was me staying within abstinence-only curriculum. STDs. So how do you scare people into not having sex? Tell them that every time you have unprotected sex, you're going to get an STD. Well, as population has increased and as the number of STDs has skyrocketed and the frequency that people have them has skyrocketed, this is likely true. I would say 30% of Americans have genital herpes. That's a lot of Americans. I mean, 70% don't, right? But, in a room of 100 people, 30 people do. That's a significant number of people. The lie here is that in 1984, a teacher said, don't play each other's instruments because somebody got AIDS that way. You can't get AIDS from sharing a clarinet. It's bodily fluids that's much, much more significant than saliva. It's blood or semen or breast milk. And even now, with a lot of medications and such, mothers with AIDS can nurse their babies and not give their babies AIDS. So that was a lie of ignorance. And I think sometimes we teach things as true because they haven't been disproven yet. AIDS was another way to really talk about hidden curriculum, implicit heterosexuality, that if you were gay, bad things would happen to you. And it was a horrifying time for the gay community, especially gay men. It was prevalent because blood and semen. And so when you look at a lot of sexual practices that may occur among gay men, it was just a gateway for AIDS to spread easily. And protected sex in the 80s, it's interesting. Birth control pills became readily accessible in the late 70s and the early 80s. So I was in high school and college. STDs weren't rampant. So if you're on the pill, that was considered protected sex because you couldn't get pregnant, but it didn't do anything to prevent STDs. And so the idea, if you couldn't get each other pregnant, you didn't need to use birth control. So condoms weren't thought of as STD prevention until the 80s and until the AIDS epidemic. So a positive outcome from all of that is that the use of condoms to prevent STDs has, I think, prevented them from skyrocketing in ways that they could. But it was a lie to say that you could get it from your clarinet. Here we are back to American history. And this says, I'm from Pennsylvania, and I absolutely learned that the Civil War was not about slavery, but about states' rights. It would be taught that way because in the South, Pennsylvania would straddle the South, they didn't want to bring slavery up because that would make them look bad. The pervasive idea was that they should have been able to keep slavery if they wanted to. So it most certainly was about slavery, but it was also about states' rights. And when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't to abolish slavery nationwide. It was to abolish slavery in the Confederate States because it was legal there. It needed to be made illegal. That was state control. And that was the part that infuriated a lot of Southern government, is how I'm reading this. But when you talk to people from anywhere out of the South, northern states, without exception, and this is me too, we learned the Civil War was totally about slavery. So I made an analogy to abortion. I think of what could cause a civil war right now, what could cause succession of states would be the overturn of Roe v. Wade and abortion, and how there are such strong opinions on both sides about whether it's right or wrong. The president giving states control of this is going to create a dichotomy and is going to create disagreement. And it's going to create states trying to control what their citizens do in other states, which is scary. So I sort of look at history repeating itself here, but we definitely learn different things depending on where you are. I absolutely learned that Abraham Lincoln is the reason slavery ended. Another thing that I'm a little bit today years old on is that because it was only declared illegal in southern states, it had to be decreed in those states immediately. It didn't have to be decreed in other states. So it took almost 2 years for every other state that might have had slaves to have the slaves in those states realize that they were free. And so June 19th, like 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, is when the last slaves realized they were free. And that's why we have Juneteenth. That holiday comes from that. Totally, totally interesting. The Civil War was not a moral debate over slavery. It was never about liberating Black people because it was humane. It was about states' rights to have their own control over the billion-dollar slave industry. Boy, you know, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. I don't know what color the libertarians are, but money is green, and green dictates everything. So Lincoln was elected president with not one single electoral vote from the South, but they realized they'd lost their influence, and that started a civil war. Some of them are like generalizations that in the desert, it's hot in the daytime and freezing cold at night. And that's true in some deserts, but not all. Sometimes it stays warm. This is a funny one to me. There's no evidence that Betsy Ross actually sewed the first American flag. Now, let's look at what women did back then. Women did all the sewing and the mending and the clothing. So if a flag was going to be sewn, it would have been sewn and created by a woman, likely. So maybe somebody wanted credit for that. That's sort of how it's given. Somebody said, yeah, my mom knitted that, and that became history. This is another interesting one, being from New England, that witches were burned in Salem during the witch trials. You think of witches and you think of them being burned. No, witches were hung or pressed. They were not burned. In the Middle East, criminals were often stoned to death. So you were put into a hole and buried with stones, or just laid on the ground and covered with stones until you were crushed. They weren't burned at the stake. So when you look at a lot of movies around Salem witch trials, if there's burning, that's not accurate historically. So this person writes, I'm Canadian, and I have a very clear memory of being in 7th grade and learning about residential schools. There's a podcast about the residential schools, and I had nightmares for months after listening to it. This was Canada's way of trying to indoctrinate their Indigenous people into the white reality, and they would force Native Canadian families to put their kids into these residential schools, and they were horribly abused. Most of them have been torn down and burned down. I imagine my friend who's hardcore devout Catholic will say that this is all fake, that those religious schools were wonderful, but they were horrible. And they have been promoted as, that the Indigenous families wanted their kids to go there, that it was a good thing. In reality, children were taken from their families, abused, and mistreated. This just goes back to the last 2 episodes of this series. You think a truth is truth and a lie is a lie. But so many things factor into what we believe to be true that it's a slippery slope. And I can be living my truth and it can be someone else's lie. And so what do? Do we try to impose our truth on everyone else? Or do we learn how to live simultaneously with a multitude of truths? And then how do we govern? If we have to have one truth that governs the populace, how do we decide what that is? Right. So this is where so many social issues come into play. So this will be another whole episode because I want to do a whole episode on biological reality. And this plays heavily into what's going on right now with the trans community and a lot of the politicalization of that community and how detrimental it is to everybody, them and us. It's fascinating. And I would encourage everyone to look at a variety of websites and make sure you're looking at where you're getting your information from. And it's interesting because this little piece of this, the BuzzFeed thing, all of the information is just anonymous. Every other thing on here, on this website that I found, everything I've just read to you has a website where the information comes from. So we've all learned a gazillion things that aren't true. We've all been told lies. We have all been led to believe that certain things are a way that they're not. Does that mean that all my teachers wanted to deceive me? No, I think we teach what we believe to be true. And I think what happens is our set of intrinsic beliefs come into what we hear, and then we decide where is the truth in this. Here's the other piece. History books, hardcore feminism back in the day when it was really centered around women, history was HIS, his story. So I would often call it her story. And if women had written the stories, if women had taken notes on what happened, would we know a very different view of American history? A friend of mine named Cheryl Barassa taught at Concord High School for a long time, and she did a women in history class. A lot of her curriculum came from the journals kept by women in the covered wagon trains and what they wrote about and what life was like for these amazing women who were a huge piece of the fabric of the story and their ideas and thoughts on the westward expansion and the treatment of indigenous cultures and everything that was going on in the 17 and 1800s. I'll end with another story about implicit bias. Part of it was me reading through that religious stuff, and I had to really read it 3 or 4 times because I'm, a blue-eyed blonde, Anglican, raised Episcopalian, now a member of the Baha'i faith, Northern New England girl who sees the world through these eyes, my upbringing. I find myself, I hope that I'm open-minded, but I can make assumptions without where I have to stop and take a breath. Oftentimes, I feel like I don't always know what to say or do because I don't want to offend somebody. So I'll often ask. And I have a friend, a person of color. She got very angry with me once because I was asking her for clarification on would something be considered racist. And she got really mad at me that I had to ask her. Here you go again, the white person asking the black person about racism. And I got it. I guess it's the equivalent of people always asking me about child loss, except that I want people to understand my version of child loss. When I have questions around issues with the trans community, I have several people in my life that are transgender. I know that some of them get very irritated by people asking them questions all the time. Google it. Well, I can Google a question and get 5 answers. So I do have 2 or 3 friends who are transgender, who are willing to answer my questions. And I'm always apologetic. Please, I'm not trying to put this on you. I just want to know what you think and where your thoughts come from so I can better understand the bigger picture, right? So I was in my car with that black friend, and I was mentioning that I had seen the Obama children, the older one, Malia, and she gave a speech, and she was so unbelievably articulate. It was mind-blowing. So I said to my friend, I could not believe how articulate she was. And she gave me the dirtiest look. And I'm like, what would I say? Why would you think she would be articulate? So my answer was, well, first of all, I haven't seen her speak since she was 10. So it was the first time I'd heard her speak. And second, the other 2 presidential daughters that I have experience of, Jimmy Carter's daughter, Amy, and Bill Clinton's daughter, Chelsea, were not articulate speakers. They took a long time to become articulate at a young age. And she was just astounding. So that relaxed her a bit. But her immediate assumption was that I didn't think she could be articulate because she was Black. That was not at all what I was thinking. But that was the immediate thought of my friend. Can I fault her for that? No, I've never been the only white person in a room full of Black people year after year after year at school or on every sports team I played on or every store I went to. I don't understand that reality. Her truth and my truth could not be more different. We have to live together. We have to be good to one another. So I look at lies told in education, and I realize that for the most part, they were set up to promote an agenda that the creators of the curriculum felt would keep citizens safe or in line or whatever. It's like cresting the mountaintop and seeing perspective, and you look back and you realize, oh my God, I was just told a pile of lies. Like, this is awful that I was told these things. We were told these things. It's eye-opening lies. So in coming episodes, I'm going to talk about some biological and scientific lies that we're told. I'm going to be told how expectations can be considered lies. And I'll look at how we manipulate the truth to make our point. I'm also going to do an episode on lies, specifically lies that women are told. I probably should then do an episode on lies that men are told, our girls and boys, because I think that we are told things as truth to keep us behaving a certain way. So anyway, be good to yourself. Be honest with yourselves. Be good to someone else. Tell them your unbridled truth. And as always, have a good day, everybody.
Hey, thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Feel free to leave a review and share my stories with your friends. Please reach out with your own stories, as I love connecting with my listeners. If you would like to get to know Molly, head over to mollybfoundation.org to see what she is all about. If you want to see what I'm up to next, you can find me on Instagram at barb_444, on Facebook as Barb Higgins, and at my website, 1000tinysteps.com. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter, a weekly way to find out what's up in the life of Barb Higgins.